U.S. forces carried out a series of airstrikes in Syria, destroying 2 facilities linked to Iranian-backed militia following a series of attacks on U.S. forces in the region. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said in a statement yesterday the facilities were believed to be run by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, and that the strikes were, quote, narrowly tailored in self-defense. The Biden administration has also deployed 900 more troops in the region following instability after the outbreak of violence in Israel-Palestine.
The White House press secretary discussed the attacks on U.S. personnel as well as Iran's possible proxy role. Let's listen in.
Now, we've also seen over the course of the last few days, actually the course of the last week, but certainly over the last couple of days of the weekend, an uptick in rocket and drone attacks by Iranian-backed proxy groups against military bases housing U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria. And we're deeply concerned about the potential for any significant escalation of these attacks in the days ahead. At the direction of President Biden, the Secretary of Defense has ordered the military to take steps to prepare for this, to ensure that we're postured appropriately, both in terms of being able to defend our forces and respond decisively as needed. The Secretary of Defense has directed 2 carrier strike groups to the region, and we are now sending more air defenses to U.S. air bases in the region. Now, we know these groups are supported by the IRGC and the regime. We know Iran continues to support Hamas and Hezbollah. And we know that Iran is closely monitoring these events and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks and spurring on others who may want to exploit the conflict for their own good or for that of Iran. We know Iran's goal is to maintain some level of deniability here, but we're not going to allow them to do that. We also are not going to allow any threat to our interest in the region to go unchallenged. We demonstrated last week that we have and will use the military capables available to us to protect and defend those interests. And those capabilities are getting bigger and better every day. As President Biden has said, our message to any hostile actor seeking to escalate or widen this conflict is very simple. Don't do it.
I feel about this conflict the way I think a lot of Americans with loved ones who have gone out to serve before. And it's that it seems intentional to have left troops at U.S. bases in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen. It's like throwing a marshmallow into a bonfire and then saying, why is the fire burning the marshmallow? Because you left it in there. You left U.S. troops in a region that is incredibly unstable, knowing very well that the United States is backing the state of Israel in a very violent conflict with Palestine, in a war with the people living in Palestine. And I think that most Americans, when they hear Janet Yellen say we can afford 2 wars, they consider human lives, not just whether or not the Treasury can issue the American dollars. And I think that it's a terrible decision to send more troops to the Middle East when what we should have done is, as soon as our ally Israel decided to escalate this conflict, we should have brought those troops home to keep them safe from retaliation from a lot of groups like Iran, who does support Hamas, who does support Hezbollah that we're fighting in Lebanon. And I think it's ridiculous and intentional that the administration left troops there, because what does this give them an excuse for? It gives the United States military and the Biden administration an excuse to really escalate conflict in the region, which I think genuinely, based on their actions, is what this administration wants, but is very clearly what the American people do not want.
We are just speed running our way into World War III at this point. They launched these strikes without any congressional oversight, which is sort of the de facto way that the military establishment conducts business nowadays. They just do whatever they want without Congress's input, without the American people's input, and they play this game of asking for forgiveness rather than permission. And unfortunately, I don't understand why troops are still in Syria to begin with. Actually, there is a Biden administration official from the Pentagon who was apparently explaining why we were still there. And rather than any kind of national security concern, she says that the U.S. military is there so that the U.S. can own Syria's resource-rich northeast, where the oil and wheat is, to give the U.S. leverage over Syria's political future, which is another way of saying regime change, because they still want to take out Assad and his political allies. When you go back to the 2020 presidential primary on the Democratic side, Tulsi Gabbard was accused of being a Russia plant because she questioned the dedication to regime change in Syria, as well as the endless wars that we keep getting involved in the Middle East. But she was really speaking for the American populace who doesn't understand why they're supposed to send their sons and daughters to potentially die in a conflict that seemingly has no bearing on American national security or stability. It seems to me like these people almost get off on warmongering. I mean, truly, they get excited about it. When the Hamas attack first happened on October 7th, the reaction from so many on social media immediately was getting jazzed up about the idea of bombing Gaza and bombing Palestinians, and of the U.S. potentially getting involved. And now more troops are going overseas to get involved in this conflict. I think it's despicable. There's no reason that we need to be getting involved in a centuries-old land dispute. But here we are, because a lot of people make a lot of money by getting involved in these conflicts.
Yeah, there was leaked audio of investors on Wall Street this past week discussing how much money they could make off of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon stocks because of the conflict in Israel. They said the quiet part out loud. And I think anyone in the United States of America that cares about democracy, that is a constitutional lawyer should consider questioning whether or not we've stuck to the United States Constitution, and honestly, whether or not the War Powers Act of 1973 is constitutional. So you have the Constitution outlining that Congress must declare war for the United States to be at war. Of course, now we have all of these gray areas where the U.S. just sends money, just sends weapons, and supports all of these proxy wars without ever declaring war on another country. You have the War Powers Act of 1973 saying that the president, the administration, can send troops abroad so long as they remain for 60 days or so and give Congress 48 hours notice. That shouldn't be enough. That is not what our Constitution says. I really think we need a reckoning with what is written in the Constitution and consider what is the best for a democracy. Elected representatives of the people in Congress should have to vote to authorize military action and military spending. The Pentagon shouldn't be able to find $6.2 billion under their couch cushions and then say, we're going to give it to Ukraine, because that's what we've decided and we found it, so we don't have to go with any other sort of procedures for approval in how we spend this money. That is ridiculous. That is not a functioning democracy. When you have 41% of the country even questioning whether or not the United States should send weapons to Israel, and yet we have sent them $158 billion to date, we really have to question the sanctity of our democracy. And I really think it's time for a constitutional challenge of how war is done in the United States of America and really rein it in so that Congress approves whenever troops, whenever weapons, and whenever money is sent out for wars abroad.
I always think back to 2016 when these types of things happen, and really the tenor of that presidential contest. And namely, the fact that at that time, former President Donald Trump was really the only person who was talking about foreign policy in a way that exercised some modicum of restraint and acknowledged the sacrifices that working class people and their family members have to make on behalf of the military-industrial complex. And to me, that was the key reason why so many establishment politicians on both the Republican and Democratic side, as well as the mainstream media, despised him, because he was taking away their cash cow. And they all somehow claimed that his tenor on foreign policy was going to get us into World War III, that we were going to be nuked by North Korea, that Russia was going to come after us, that he was too cozy with dictators around the world, when clearly what he was doing was trying to develop some kind of relationship to keep these people in check so that they didn't feel the need to lash out and demonstrate their power. He did it actually kind of expertly. Now we get Biden in there, who has been on the wrong side of every foreign policy decision in his entire career in politics. And within just a couple of years, the world has been thrown into disarray, and we are now sending more troops abroad and launching missile strikes and getting ourselves into more conflict than ever.
I think back to what Truman said back in the 40s when Israel was created as a state. He talked about how the conflict existed in the region and how either group didn't want the other group there, wanted to drive the other group into the sea. The difference being that the people of Palestine were there before a lot of boats arrived carrying Jewish people coming over from Europe to create the state of Israel. He described that conflict, describing both sides, Then you have Joe Biden giving a speech on the floor of Congress in 1986. And what he said is, we need an Israel to protect U.S. interests in the region. This is precisely why we've become a target and why our troops and our bases, whether or not they should be there, are a target in the Middle East, because they recognize that the United States is fighting for the United States' interests. But who within the United States? The elites who stand to profit from these wars. Whether we want to talk about oil, whether we want to talk about Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, they're not taking the human calculation of lives lost, because apparently the working class is expendable to many of our leaders. And so when we think about having an ounce of responsibility, I think back to Jimmy Carter's interview on the issue in 2013, when he discussed what was going on in the region. And he said, the Netanyahu regime really doesn't seem to want a two-state solution. It seems he wants a one-state solution. And that is dangerous, and that is terrible even for Israel. So when we think about the United States backing the creation of Israel, that was a very different state from when Joe Biden gave the speech saying we need an Israel to protect our interests in the region. And that Israel was also very different when the Netanyahu regime was in power and when Jimmy Carter is talking about how he's dangerous. We really need to reevaluate who our ally is, because who our ally is changes based on who is in the leadership of that country. And quite frankly, how that country's borders change in the case of Israel-Palestine. We've created so much instability in the Middle East, thinking in the short term, protecting our short-term interests, our profits that quarter or that year for the executives who stand to profit off of these conflicts, not thinking of the long-term conflicts on the country mental health-wise, not thinking of the long-term interests of the country when we talk about people losing their lives in this war and the ramifications of having wars abroad. And then all of the young people grow up to hate the United States because we've caused all this instability in the region. A lot of our enemies are broader and enemies we've created, quite frankly. And it's time we end that terrible cycle and be really honest about when we want to send troops and why, and if we're making this situation better or worse by being a presence in the region.
We'll be right back with more Rising after this.